Coming up on the payoff. Buckle up for this one. My man Tim Ryan is an American activist. He's a drug abuse interventionist. He's an author and a speaker, and he's the founder and executive director of A Man in Recovery. He's got a book. He's got an incredible wife. They have an incredible mission, and Tim has been in the game for a very long time recovery-wise. He is 10 years sober as of early November 2022, but he had a lifetime, it feels like talking to him, of addiction, heroin addiction, while he was extremely successful, living in Chicago, working in one of the most beautiful buildings, living in one of the most beautiful areas, all the while a complete junkie and heroin addict until he finally ran out of moves. His story of recovery is not one that's all unicorns and rainbows. He lost a son to addiction in his early recovery, and he talks about how he was able to find the strength in recovery to get through that and how he uses that experience to help other people that are going through the same kind of thing today. This guy's the man. He said at the very end, if I could have his stamp on my body or a bumper sticker that said property of Alcoholics Anonymous, I would do it. This guy is a great representation of what true sobriety is all about. Tim Ryan. But first, Kevin Souza. Okay, so you grow up outside of Chicago. I know a lot about your story, but the folks listening don't. What was it like for you growing up as a young future alcoholic?
It was different. I was born in 68. I'm 54. So it was the 70s. My parents, for some reason, couldn't have kids, so they adopted 4 kids. My older brother, Dan, was 2 years older than me. And then my little brother and sister, Katie and Kevin, they're twins. They're Chippewa Indian. So we were the different family, because back then there was no Hispanics, African Americans. So my little brother and sister got called a lot of derogatory names. I learned to protect them with my fists in my mouth, but we were latchkey kids. My dad worked at the Board of Trade with E.F. Hutton for 26 years. Never missed a day of work. Ultimately was senior vice president, ran the whole country. My mom helped co-found a company by the name of Market Day, which was a food co-op, a nonprofit that made money for schools. That blew up nationwide. There was no consequences. They did the best they could. We had a good life. We lived on a lake, and the lake was my world. Water skiing, fishing, sailing. We could walk across out into the fields and go shoot shotguns and go shoot skeet. I had a good childhood. But what had happened with me was my best friend was 18. I was a freshman in high school. He was a senior, and the drinking age in Wisconsin was 18 years old.
And how far were you from Wisconsin?
Half hour from Lake Geneva.
Okay.
So, and that's like the Hamptons of the Midwest. So Randy and I, every weekend, we're going up to Lake Geneva drinking, and I'd walk in with his ID, give it to somebody else. He'd walk in. But back then, nobody was getting DUIs. You knew all the cops. You got pulled over. They poured out your beer. They called your parents to pick you up. At 15, I was hanging out with some older kids. I experimented with cocaine. First line I did that night, I had a quarter gram fronted to me. And, I got on the work program. I ran a pizza restaurant, and I'd get out of school at 10:30, junior and senior year. I'd go home. I'd go to the pizza place, flip on the ovens, go home, water ski all afternoon, and then go open up the pizza shop at 4. But every Thursday, Friday, Saturday night, it was party. During
the week, though, cocaine. you sort of kept it going, like kept it together.
Kept it going, and still no consequences. I went down to college in Louisiana, and it was a great experience. You learn manners, you learn respect. But I also learned that ecstasy was legal in the state of Texas in 85, and they made it illegal. And there was a lot of pharmaceutical grade ecstasy sitting around. So we started running X we'd go to Mississippi, pick up 10 grand cash, drive to Houston or Dallas, wherever they wanted us, pick up 10,000 hits of X for $1 a piece, come back, sell it. The money guy got his money, and it just allowed me the opportunity to do more drugs and party and get into hallucinogenics. And school was a party thing for me. I think my best report card, I had a 2.0 grade average. My mom framed it because that's the type of kid I was.
Yeah, but hold on. See, you talk about, you had a 2.0 GPA, but your story From the very beginning, you knew how to make money. I mean, you're talking about it right now. You weave it into your conversation like it's second nature. It's not second nature for all of us. Certainly wasn't second nature for me, but you're growing up and you're finding out ways to make money. And even though you're doing a ton of drugs and you're drinking a lot,
I always worked. Oh,
Yeah.
my dad was dirt poor growing up, and my grandfather was born in 1880. So he didn't even have my dad until after the Depression. He got remarried. I think my grandma was 40 and my grandfather was 60 or 65. But he died when my dad was 15, and my dad instilled work ethic. I mean, on the weekends when I was 9 years old, my older brother Dan and I worked at my dad's friend's bar, and we'd hump up 200 cases of beer, all the soda pop, buckets of ice I can remember we got $2.50 each. We got a Hershey bar, we got a pack of double mint gum, and all the soda pop we could drink. I've always worked. I mean, my dad taught us if I wanted boat gas, you go rake the leaves, go earn the money to pay for it. He bought the boat, but you want to use it, you pay for it. So I'm grateful for that,
Yeah.
But of course, it allowed me the opportunity to always work for myself if needed and hide in my addiction ultimately.
When did stuff start to you mentioned no consequences, you're making money, but you're doing a lot of drugs and you're drinking, you're also dealing drugs. When did you start to have consequences?
I can remember, must have been out of high school in one of the summers where some girlfriends of mine had a party, and I can remember Heather and Lisa pulling me aside and saying, Tim, you've got to stop. You're out of control. And I knew I was, but man, I love cocaine. I love partying. But what I did is I kept people at bay. I knew everyone. I was friends with the freaks, the jocks, the losers, everyone in between. But I didn't like people getting too close to me because I didn't want them to know. But it was really after college when I came back and dropped out, and I met a guy, Roger, that was 20 years older than me, but he had the coke hookup, and we'd literally go to Chicago every day. We'd go sit in a noon mass on the north side of Chicago in a Colombian. That's when the Colombians were the big cocaine dealers, and a lady had hand us 2 ounces of cocaine in a newspaper. We'd leave mass. We would go back, sell the 1 ounce, which paid for both, and we were smoking an ounce of cocaine every day. And it got to a point to where I needed to stop. I started stealing checks from my mom's business, from my brother's bank account. And in January of 1990, at 21 years old, I checked myself into treatment.
And what was that experience like? Your first one?
Go ahead.
What was that experience like?
I loved it, but I went in with the thinking that I wanted to quit doing drugs and I wanted to figure out how to drink like a normal person. I went through the motions, and I can remember there was 13 Chicago cops. So I thought all the cops were alcoholics. I didn't realize Parkside Lodge had the EAP contract, but now I know those things. But I can remember 2 days before I got out, actually 3 weeks in, they sat me down and said, your father's insurance has run out, but you really need to stay another week. And I signed a document. I think I ended up having to pay $25,000 for another week. But a guy came in and spoke who was in long-term recovery. There was 38 of us as clients, shared his message. And when he was done, he said, one of you will be sober in a year and a third of you will be dead. And I put up my hand. I said, excuse me, what did you say? He said, listen to me, kid. A third of you will be dead in a year and one of you will be sober. And it scared me. I said, what do I do? He said, don't drink, get a sponsor, work steps, and go to meetings. So I went to the Chris Lake Alno Club. I'd put my hand up. I'm looking for a sponsor. Nobody would pick on me. I'd be like, yes, got away with it again. See, I'm the guy that thought I could get sober through osmosis. I could quote the big book like the back of my hand. I could tell you everything you needed to hear. But I did step 1 and step 12. I did no internal work and started a water ski school with my buddy Mike Frankenbush, and had an asphalt seal coating business, and had all my buddies working for me and making money and going to meetings and having fun. And I started competing in barefoot water skiing again in 1990, that spring. And that summer I won Illinois State, Michigan State, Wisconsin State. I slotted to win the U.S. Nationals, and at the Midwest Regionals, I fell in a trick run and blew out L4, L5, and S1 in my lower back, and my career was over instantly. And Dr. Wu introduced me to a drug called Vicodin. I didn't like opiates at the time. I went back to smoking weed. 2 days after smoking weed, I went back to drinking. As soon as I started drinking, I started doing cocaine. And Burn those businesses. My partner said, Tim, I'm taking the ski school to Florida. You're not coming with. You're a liability. And, as the story goes, I relocated to Austin, Texas to get away from drugs, pulled credit card fraud on my friend, got to spend some time in the Travis County jail. My go-to was always go back to meetings. So I started going to meetings at the Bolden Group and the 101 Club in Austin. And I met some guys that were all sober, marketing cable television door to door. So I got in with them. And we spent about 6 months in Austin making money. I traveled across the country to Michigan, Houghton Lake, and all that. C-Tech Cable, I still remember it. Made a ton of money, and I had the opportunity to go to Buffalo, New York, and be a manager. I did that for about 6 months, traveled the country, and a year later, the gentleman with Jones Intercable, Dan Templeton, I still remember his name, called me and said, Tim, I need you to come back and run another cable project, but start your own company. And I did, and shacked up with a lady 10 years older than me, started drinking, made, I had 60 people working for me at that time. We had the third largest cable marketing company nationwide. And I was profiting about 25 to 30 grand a week. Made my first million, but was right back to smoking cocaine and giving my drug dealer 20 grand a month to bring me an ounce of cocaine. It was insane.
This story is amazing. This whole time, are you in and out of sobriety this whole time? So you're in and out.
Once I went to Buffalo the second time, when I was in Buffalo the first time, I was sober the whole time. And then we left there and went to Colorado and California, and I ended up going back there. And as soon as I came back to New York by myself, I started drinking. And a gentleman that had worked for me the year prior had divorced his wife, and I had to bring presents to her house. And I had her number, and I messaged her, and she invited me over for dinner. And I bought a bottle of Captain Morgan and never left. And next thing I started, my life was so friggin' insane. I don't know how I lived through it, to be honest.
No, neither do I. You ended up meeting your first wife, and you talk about that, like the fact that she was instrumental in your life for so long.
I met her after I buried the marketing company in New York. I went from making 25, 30 grand a week to moving back to Illinois. I owed the IRS 80 grand. I was about $250,000 in debt. And I took a job for $300 a week as a data processing recruiter, working out of a guy's basement, learning the technology space recruiting. He happened to be sober at that time and started making money, started drinking, got my first house. And then about a year later, I went to work in the management consulting space. And that's where I met Shannon, my future wife. And, we started dating and I got her pregnant. So I dragged her to the courthouse and married her. And she had Nicholas, who was 3 years old, who had a deadbeat dad, never knew him. So I adopted Nick right away, and we had Max, Tanner, and Abby. But in that, 16 years of marriage, I was sober 1 year. I mean, I was completely drinking. Ultimately, I got into doing heroin, and it was just a shit show. And you know what? I worked hard. I was a Cub Scout pack master for 8 years, and every parade and all this, I did everything. I was very involved, but nobody knew I was doing heroin.
How did you maintain that functionality where people don't know? Because we're talking about heroin's a hell of a drug.
It was interesting because Max, Tanner, and Abby were all born, and they were 9 months later, pregnant with another. They're only a couple years apart each. And I quit doing cocaine and went back to 12-step meetings, got about 14 months sober, started another consulting firm, built a beautiful house. Life was good. And again, going to meetings, but not working a program. And I met a guy by the name of Joel, who was 32. We're the same age at the time. And it turns out Joel had worked for a company in Chicago called On Time Courier, delivering packages as a bike messenger. And I said, did you happen to know a guy by the name of Darris? And he said, that hillbilly from Louisiana with the red pickup truck? I said, yeah, that's Darris. He said, how do you know Darris? I said, he lived across the street from me in college. We became best friends. And when I came back, I dragged him with, and he ultimately went to work for this company. So Joel and I had an instant friendship. And about 3 weeks later, he asked me to take him to Chicago to move out of his apartment. As I'm moving him out, his roommate Saba popped out of one of the rooms and said, who are you and what are you doing here? I said, I'm Tim. I'm helping your friend Joel move out. I said, who are you and what are you doing? He said, my name's Savin. I'm doing heroin. Do you want to do some? Now, I was 14 months clean, but not working a program. I said, sure. I did 1 bag of heroin and that was it. And game on. And that went from 1 bag to 5 grams a day to 8 overdoses, dead multiple times, and multiple driving on revokes and multiple DUIs, and the wheels came off. But for the first, I don't know, probably 8 years, I just did heroin. I quit drinking. Nobody knew. I worked in the corporate world. I ran a management consulting firm. I mean, Conagra Foods was one of my biggest clients, and I had taken away a ton of work from IBM and Price Waterhouse. Our team managed at the time the biggest SAP implementation in the world, and I recruited and hired everyone, and I ran the entire project. Full-blown heroin addiction.
How about your wife? Was she onto this at all, or was
shit, she knew. She okay. Was trying to send me to Thailand and all this, but in hindsight, I don't want to speak for her, but it's like she co-signed my BS. And if I was functioning and paying the bills, I was left to my own devices because no one was telling me what to do. But in hindsight, in 2008, I got sent to prison the first time for 4 driving on revokes. I got 4 driving on revokes in a year. I got 2 of them by Officer White.
The same guy. Cop. It's impossible, right?
8 months apart in 2 different cars. Who does that happen
in Chicago?
Tim Ryan. Yeah, it happens to me. But anyhow, that was January 25th of 2008. I got sentenced to a year in prison. You do 61 days, they release you. I got out, and I can remember I told all my kids I was going to India on business for 2 months because I worked in the technology space. And when I would call home, it would come up prison. And I can remember Nick would be like, Dad, are you calling from the prison hotel? I'm like, yeah, I'm calling from the prison hotel. Once I got out, I think Nick was, I don't know, 14. I told him 13. I told him the truth. A couple years later, I told all the other kids. But in December 16th of 2010, because when I got out of prison, I went right back. I started another executive search firm. I had an office in the Wrigley building on Michigan Avenue, making a lot of money, and I went right back to using, and my heroin addiction got really bad. I mean, my day would consist of, and I didn't have a driver's license, so I couldn't drive. And December 16th of 2010, I drove one more time and I overdosed while driving, and I hit 2 cars and I put 4 people in the hospital, one being a 9-month-old baby. And by the grace of God, they were okay. I sat in Cook County Jail for a week, eventually manipulated my mom into putting up the bail money. And I got out. I went right back to using, started fighting this case. And now everyone knows I'm a heroin addict. And in the mid of fighting it, about 3 months in, I was taking a hot bath. I was dope sick, and Nick came in the bathroom, who was 17. He said, what's wrong, Pops? And I said, what do you think, you idiot? I'm dope sick. He said, not anymore, Dad. Today's your lucky day. And he threw 2 bags of heroin on the bathroom counter. And I got out of the tub and I did them. I remember going in his room and I said, Nick, what in the, can I swear on here?
Oh, yeah.
I said, Nick, what in the fuck are you doing? He said, don't worry, Dad. I'm just selling a little bit. I said, you need to shut this down a little immediately. I said, this is heroin. This isn't weed. This is heroin. And you know what this drug did to me and has done to me? And my son looked right at me and said, well, Dad, you're a successful drug addict. And I said, why would you say that? He said, well, we got a nice house, got an office in the Wrigley building. You make a good living. So Nick's delusional mind, because I functioned, I was successful. Couple months later, I caught him snorting heroin. We started doing heroin together. And that's how my son and I bonded. Unless you've been in addiction like this, you don't comprehend it.
I get it.
But the crazy thing is, Pete, parents will justify drinking alcohol with their 14, 15, 16-year-old kid. But when it comes, oh, you did drugs with them, you're a monster. Alcohol's the #1 killer out there. And I tell parents, so your kid, 22 years old, gets a DUI and kills a family. You blame alcohol, but you don't go back to 14 years old when mom and dad said it's okay to start drinking in the house. They enabled that behavior. But anyhow, not here nor there.
Welcome to One Star Rewind. a new podcast about those dreaded one-star reviews that every business owner hates to receive, but yet every customer loves to read. During this podcast, we will peel back that one-star review to better understand how it happened, when it happened, and what the business owner is doing after receiving that one-star review. This podcast will be about love, hate, and laughter. On One Star Rewind, we will meet with real business owners who will tell their stories and how they do rely on reviews for their business. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or download us at roguemedianetwork.com. Please subscribe, but only rate and review for not a one-star review. Join us each time for a new review and a new story.
Bros and foes and heroes. Gonna tell you about bros and foes and heroes. Gonna tell you about.
Hey, I'm Zach.
And I'm Mike.
And we have a fantastic new podcast to tell you about. Bros, foes, and heroes. It's the two of us looking into the world of comics, breaking down some characters that you may have never heard of, and some that are just absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, so Zach comes up with a character each time, and I go into it just completely blind. I don't know who this person is or what their abilities are or anything, and basically I guess we kind of go over their origin story and just some of the ridiculous stuff that maybe, especially Golden Age stuff.
Oh, Golden Age stuff is always the best, and we will make sure to highlight all of the shenanigans and just absolute weirdness of everything.
Yeah, that's right. So subscribe today and follow us on Instagram at Bros, Foes, Heroes.
And if you don't, I know where you live. Not really, but please subscribe.
Bros and foes and heroes.
What are we doing here, Rusty? What are we going to do?
Yep, we're doing the King of the Hill Rewatch podcast.
King of the Hill
Yes, sir.
Rewatch podcast. Yeah, so we're going to go through one episode at a time. Come along for the ride with us.
Come check it out.
And give me a good like Dale Gribble quote to go out on.
Wingo.
Yeah, Wingo.
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 All right. Well, join us for the King of the Hill Rewatch podcast.
In the heart of Texas, that drinks his brew.
911, what's your emergency?
Do you hear that? It's coming from the house.
It's coming from inside the house? Do you mean? Could it be?
The Poltergeist. New from Rogue Media. Two haunted hotties talking about haunted places. Every episode we dive deep into the darkest places and give you a bit of history.
We're getting spooky in all the right places.
You've gobbled your last ghoul.
Follow along for the craziest and spookiest stories with Debbie's Dark Tourism. The Stanley Hotel,
Winchester House,
The Alamo,
Hotel Monte Vista,
and more spooky places. Find us at _Poltergals. POLTERGALS.
Look over your shoulder. It's us,
The Poltergals. Wherever you consume the podcast, you can find us there.
Let's go backwards real quick. You mentioned you were about to say what your day consisted of, and before we kind of move into the recovery, I want to hear what your day consisted of at the height of this heroin addiction.
I'd get up at about 4:30 in the morning, 5. I would make coffee. My coffee cup would be half vodka, half coffee. I'd make a big rig of heroin. I'd shoot some dope. I'd get ready for work. I'd get to the Aurora train station. I'd take the 8 a.m. express train to downtown Chicago, which was an hour ride. I'd get in at 9. That's because the bar opened at Union Station. I could have 3 or 4 martinis. I'd call Flacco, my dope dealer. He'd meet me at the Wrigley building. I'd get 5 grams of heroin. I'd go up to my office. I'd shoot heroin. I was at the Billy Goat Tavern 5 days a week at 10:30 a.m. because that's when they open. And I thought Jeff, the bartender, was just the coolest guy because he had worked at the Billy Goat for 26 years. And I'd sit in there and talk like I was some big shot. And people like, how did you make money? Back then, the technology space was blowing through the roof. So I could place someone making, $100,000 base salary, and I'm getting a $25,000 fee. I place someone making 200 grand, I made 50 grand. So I could always make a deal. It might be a month or two, but I always had money to support my habit. I go to the Billy Goat. The afternoon, I go back to my office, make some calls, shoot some dope. And usually 2 to 3 to 4 nights a week, I slept under Lower Wacker Drive with the homeless people because that's where I was more comfortable instead of being in my 5-bedroom house with my wife and 4 kids. I actually had Patch and Mike, who were 2 homeless guys I met over by Union Station, and I provided them with burner cell phones and money so they could have a couple jabs of heroin, which was 14 to 16 bags. And I said, anytime I call you, you need to be at my office within an hour with one of those jabs of heroin. So I never ran out of drugs. I always had a dealer on speed dial. And it's disgusting to think that's what was important to me because I didn't want to get sick and I'd been sick thousands of times and I'm going to quit. And, in hindsight, it's like, why didn't my wife or parents intervene and do an intervention? And it was insane. But yeah, that's where my day consisted of and where it took me to. And then ultimately October 30th of 2012, after fighting my case for 21 months, Judge Wattis at 26 in California, downtown Chicago, slammed his gavel and said 7 years in the Illinois Department of Corrections. And he wanted to give me 12 to 15 years.
What's that feeling like when you hear him say that? Are you relieved almost?
I can remember I've got a memory like a friggin' elephant.
Yeah, I do too. I respect that.
Hey. And I can remember standing there, and here's me. I walk into court with the Hells Angels Carhartt jacket on that I've got 60 bags of heroin hidden in. So I take my coat off, I go up, and I can remember them, they're all arguing, and he said 3, 3, and 1, and slams his gavel. And I look at my lawyer, I said, what's that mean? He said, 7 years, but you'll be out in a year and a half. So they took me in back, and the bailiffs got me, or whatever. And I said, look, I need my coat. He said, no, you don't. I said, it's got my wallet and cell phone. So he sent my lawyer to get it. I gave my lawyer the cell phone, my wallet. I said, mail this back. And they took me in the holding cell, and bags of heroin started falling out of my coat. So I was able to get them out and sneak it in. And I just didn't want to be dope sick before you can see a doctor there and they give you meds. But I didn't realize if I would have got caught with that amount of heroin, it's 15 to 45 years first offense.
Wow.
Yeah. So that was another God shot. And
now, do you stay sober in prison?
Hell yeah, I did.
You did?
So I went from Cook County Jail 3 days. Then they transfer you to Northern Illinois Receiving Center right next to Stateville Prison in Joliet, Illinois. There you're locked down 24/7. You never leave your cell until they figure out what prison they're sending you to based on your security risk, what type of crime. Are you a sex offender? Are you a murderous rapist? Are you just some drug addict who likes to drive cars like me? But then the sickness kicked in, and I shit and puked myself for 2 weeks straight. I did not sleep a wink for a month, total insomnia. But I'll never forget that pain. And I was damn near drinking a gallon of vodka and shooting 5 grams of heroin a day. I had a severe drug addiction, but I'll never forget that pain. And about 2 weeks in, once I got over the vomiting and I could get some water down, I looked out of my cell window and I just put my head up and I said, God, higher power, Allah, Buddha, Fred, whatever's out there, please take away this obsession and compulsion to use. And I swear I will turn my will and life over to you. And I kind of sat back and I said, please let me get into Sheridan Prison, because there's 28 prisons. There's only 2 at the therapeutic drug treatment program. And the next day I was transferred to Sheridan Prison. And I'll tell you, I was the happiest son of a bitch. They bust you in there. It was 40 miles from my house. You do 30 days in the SEG building. You do 30 days in orientation hall, and it's structured. You do group 3 hours a day, 5 days a week. They got a structure board. You fight, you're kicked out. You're belligerent, you're kicked out. And I didn't realize for every 4 months you do, they take 30 days off your sentence. So I got into one of the little buildings in back after SAG orientation hall, because you don't want to be on a deck with 100 guys, 3 stories tall. It just smells like ass and it's disgusting. But anyhow, I got into one of the little buildings. When I walk down the hall and I walk into the cell, and there's this big black guy, 400 pounds, all muscle, sitting on the bunk reading an AA big book. And I kind of walked in the doorway and I said, "Hey man, what's up?" And he's got a book and he looks at me like I bothered him. And he goes, "Hey Whitey, you into recovery?" I said, "Yeah, why?" He said, "Because if not, brother, you ain't coming in this fucking cell, because that's all we do in here." I said, "I'm into recovery." He said, "Hey, I'm Big Perk. Nice to meet you." I said, "Hey, Big Perk, I'm Tim." And then he looks at me again. He goes, "Tim, I think I'm going to call you Powder." I said, "You can call me whatever you want." And Perk was a gang chief with conservative vice lords for 25 years.
In Chicago.
Yeah, he's a ruthless man. I mean, I can tell you a story when his cousin had sold $25,000 from him, so he duct taped him to a chair and he ripped off his lips with a set of ice grips. And it was just business. If you owed him over $400, he'd take you to a 3rd or 4th story abandoned building, and he'd pull out his gun and say, "Where do you want me to shoot you? Or you can jump out of the window." And most people jumped out of the window and they paid him the next day. He had been to prison 10 different times. His son had been shot and killed on the west side of Chicago 3 months prior to me walking into that cell, Hanson. And Hanson was married. He wasn't gang affiliated and had a great career. And he saw some guys beating up a girl and he got involved and spun him off. And some gang guys came up and lit him up, thought he was a gang member, and killed him. So, you know, Perk and we never got a TV. I wasn't there to do push-ups for noodles and get swole. We went through the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous. We read 350, 400 books. We did group every morning, 3 hours a day, 5 days a week. We walked the yard every day and had a 12-step base meeting. We sat in the day room at night and had a 12-step base meeting. I was there to change. I watched a corn grow get cut down. My wife at the time had brought 2 of my kids to visit every 2 weeks. I can remember bringing Nick once, and he was just high as a kite. I can remember my daughter Abby coming at 12 years old, and Abby had boobs and looked older and was in her cheerleading outfit, but wanted to come see Dad, and all those inmates gawking at her. And I swore I'd never do this to my children again. And you know, my wife divorced me in prison. We lost our home in foreclosure. They had to move into Shannon's mom's house about 20 minutes away. My kids had to change schools because of me.
Let me ask you, you take responsibility, you say because of me, but what is happening to you while you're in prison and you're getting into recovery? Because, you know, I've been lucky enough, and I don't do it anymore. I used to do it, and I need to do it again, is when you take meetings to prisons, right? And you talk to those guys in there, and they will tell you that there's not a lot of great 12-step meetings in that, a lot of times in the prison system. So for somebody like you, an inmate, to bring that to them, I would imagine there's something so special about that and something that you get out of that. So, and as you're in the midst of this great recovery, you know, how are you feeling about all this going on outside the walls of prison?
So the prison had a contract with a company by the name of WestCare. Well, WestCare is a nonprofit that does prison programs, cognitive behavior therapy, and all that Yahoo stuff. And they ran the program, and it was good, but they brought in H&I. So every 2 weeks you had to sign up. You could go over to the church building, and outside 12-step people came in. And these were hardcore people. I actually got a crazy story. A guy by the name of Manny Mills, Google this guy's name, Manny Mills, had come in and he had done a program called Freedom of God's Way. So you sign up to get out of your cell because otherwise you're in it 18 hours a day. I signed up to go to the barber shop every 2 weeks just because you could go to the barber shop and it was like being in the street out there and people talking and BSing. So I made the time benefit me. But this Manny Mills guy had made a lot of money, did a bunch of fraud, went to prison for 35 years. He ended up doing 6 years in the Fed joint. but he started one of the first prison ministries. And he came in and was sharing his story. And after the second day, it's like the guy was talking to me, and he looks at me and he says, "What's your name and why are you here?" in his broken Puerto Rican accent. And I said, "I'm Tim Ryan. I'm an alcoholic. I'm a heroin addict, and I'm here to change." And he said, "Tim, you got two choices." He said, "You can go through the motions and be on the same bullshit you've been on, or you can change and let God open the doors and walk through them." And that's exactly what I did. So as we're going to leave, Manny had wrote a book called Radical Timeout. You can't make this shit up. And he says, "Tim, do you want a copy?" I said, "Sure." And I grabbed it and I opened it. And the first thing I see is Crystal Lake, Illinois. That's my hometown. My grandfather built the first houses on the lake. That's where we lived. And I said, "Manny, Crystal Lake, Illinois." He said, "Do you know the town?" I said, "Yes, I grew up there." He said, "That's where I paroled to, however many years ago." And he said, "Tim, we have a prison ministry and we'll pick you up at the gate and help you out." I said, "I don't need that." But anyhow, I went back, read the book, and I wrote him a letter. 4 months later, I get a letter in the mail from Quantum Executive Search. Now, remember, I was in the search business. So I'm thinking I'm getting sued. When I read this letter, and it's from a guy, Gary, and he says, "Hey, Tim, my name's Gary." He said, "My dear friend, Manny Mills, shared your inspiring letter." And he said, "I know who you are." He said, "You owned Wabo Recruiting. You were our competition." He said, "We're praying for you, and if you need anything, let us know." And when I got out of prison, 4 days later, I went to an AA meeting, and then I went to this thing called Radical Timeout that they did once a week on the Wheaton College's property. And it was all people going to prison or coming out, from congressmen to aldermen in Chicago, and everybody came together. But I couldn't have made this stuff up and had this happen. And one of the other things, and I'll end with this, about 2 weeks in prison, you got to go over and get your dress clothes and your boots, and you had to go to the school building. I walk up to the table, and this guy, the CEO, looks up at me. And I said, "Hi, Mattress." He said, "My name's Officer Nowak. Go stand in the corner." So I did, and he comes up to me, he goes, "Tim, what are you doing here?" I said, "Mattress, what's up?" He said, "Don't call me that name, and do not let people know that you know me. They'll kick you out of here." Mattress lived on the property of Skydive Chicago, and I had been skydiving with him for 10 years. So now one of the guards is a personal friend of mine or acquaintance. So it made me feel safer, if that makes any sense. But these were all God shots.
Yeah, God shots, God winks, whatever you want to call them. And they'll put wind in your sails. And when you start to turn your life over, like you asked, or like you did, right? It's all action based. Things like this start to happen. Now you get out of prison, and what starts to happen for you?
So I can remember about 2 months prior to getting out, Shannon had come in and said, "Look, you got three options. Your parents are willing to help you. They'll rent a house that all of us can cohabitate in." I said, "No." She said, "They'll rent a house for you and the kids." I said, "I'm not going back to Oswego. Not a good idea." She said, "They'll find a place for you." I said, "Put it in downtown Naperville. Find me a place," because I had to walk. So my mom and former wife found a little townhouse in downtown Naperville where I could walk downtown. I could walk to the Elno Club, and I could walk to the train. I got out December 16th of 2013 after doing 13 and a half months. 3 years to the day, I caught my case. Another ironic moment. Shannon picked me up, took me to the iPhone store, got a new phone, and took me to the townhouse that was set up, and our furniture was in there because they were living at her mom's. All my kids came over that night. We had Portillo's, and that's the last time I was together with them as my kids as a family. I went back into the technology space. I didn't, 4 days later, my parole agent showed up. I went to a meeting, got another sponsor with 21 years, went through the steps again, didn't miss a meeting for 2.5 years, went back into the technology space, but I was commuting 2.5 hours each way to work by 2 trains and a bus because I had to pay child support, pay my bills. That lasted about 3 months. I was asked to start the first Heroin Anonymous meeting in DuPage County, Illinois. I did. 2 weeks later, I had a 20-year-old kid come in. He said, "Well, hey, I take Xanax. Can I sit in?" I said, "Sure." 2 weeks later, I had a mom come in with her daughter, and she said, "You operate differently. Can I sit in on the meeting?" And I had an epiphany. Why don't I have the parents or loved one come with the person struggling at the same time, since this is a family disease? and we'll talk everything and put it on the table. And mom's the enabler, dad's the foot up the ass, blah, blah. And it started blowing up. I ultimately had 7 of these. You know, one was Dixon, Illinois. That was 100 miles from my house. I ran on Monday night. Tuesday night, I did Streeter, Illinois. That was 90 miles from my house. Wednesday night, I did Princeton, Illinois. That was 100 miles from my house. Thursday, we did Crystal Lake and Naperville. And Friday, I did DeKalb. And then I set up a nonprofit. I quit my job. I called my mom. I said, can I borrow 15 grand? She said, for what? I said, I'm going to set up this nonprofit, a Man Recovery Foundation. I thought I was going to save the world. And she said, I have one question to ask you. I said, what's that? She said, are you going to pay me back this time? I said, yes, ma'am. She said, the money will be in your account tomorrow. And I set up my foundation thinking I'm going to save the world.
How long had you been sober at this time?
Almost 2 years.
Okay.
Almost 2 years. Had been through all the steps. And you got to understand, I've been around the room since 1984.
Yeah.
You know, since I was a sophomore in high school. So I'm living recovery now.
Well, you're on fire. A guy that's doing the 2.5 hour commute, to me, that just says so much about somebody who is of purpose and who is driven.
And when I did that commute, every night I was back for the 8 p.m. AA meeting.
Yeah.
And Saturday I was at the club at 6 in the morning. And I walked, and I didn't have Uber money and cab money and all that stuff. So I did what I needed to do, and I put in the damn work. My 14-year-old son, Tanner, moved in with me. Nick was in active addiction. He had been in treatment a couple more times. I stumbled into working in treatment. So that allotted me a paycheck to now run my nonprofit and never take a salary. I never took a salary from it. We gave away about $1.5 million. A bunch of that was my speaking event fees, but nevertheless, we helped thousands of people, and it was a great run. But, I stumbled into treatment, and at 19 months sober, Nick was in treatment for the 6th time. And I remember going to visit him, and we were talking, and he's 20 now. And he's like, Dad, you're sober. I'm sober. He's like, picture me and you, a father and son team, speaking in high schools about our story. And I said, Nick, this would be epic, but I need you to stay sober. He's like, I will. He got out of treatment. 30 days later, he's back in Cook County Jail trying to sell bogus pills to buy heroin. He did 45 days in jail, got out. His mom picked him up, took him to lunch, fed him, and said, we're done. You're not coming to my house. You're not coming to your dad's. All you do is lie, cheat, and steal. He's like, I got it figured out. 5 days out of jail, I called Nick, and I said, Nick, come to my house and get Narcan. We're starting to distribute that. And he said, Dad, I'm not on that bullshit anymore. And I believed him. 2 days later, August 1st at 6 in the morning, Shannon called me and said, Nick overdosed again. She's coming to pick me up. And I normally don't share this part of the story. She was at my house in 10 minutes, got in her car, and I plugged my iPhone into her charger. And a song came up on my playlist by the band 6 a.m., which is Nikki Sixx's band that he did in correlation with his book called The Heroin Diaries. The song that came on was a call called Courtesy Call, and it's about finding someone dead, OD'd in a hotel room. So I unplugged the phone immediately. We shot to Hinsdale Hospital, ran into the emergency room. Tim and Shannon Ryan here to see our son, Nick. He overdosed. And about 30 seconds later, the chaplain walked out. I knew instantly Nick was dead. No questions asked. And I'll ask people, what was my next thought? And they're like, oh, you wanted to get high. No, my son died on my 21-month sobriety date. My next thought was, I'm going to call my sponsor, which was my first call. And I went to a meeting that night, and I never looked back. I could get into going in and look at your dead kid and all this. And for years, I thought I killed Nick, and I didn't. I didn't turn Nick onto heroin. He did it on his own. Did he follow in my footsteps? Yes. Nick had been to treatment 6 times. Nick had been to sober living. Nick chose to use again, and he died. But what had happened at the hospital, we're dealing with all this crap, trying to get family in. And the cops take me down the hall, and they said, there they are. And there was 2 kids, 2 boys and a girl. And I said, who's that? He said, that's your son's girlfriend and his 2 friends that were with him. We're going to charge them all with drug-induced homicide. And I said, no, you're not. And they said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to get them all into treatment, because that could have been me getting high with my son. But what I found out after the fact was Nick and his girlfriend had showed up at this guy Gary's house, and he had snorted 2 bags of heroin, Gary gave him a bar of Xanax. You mix a benzodiazepine with an opiate, it suppresses your system. And about a half hour later, he was overdosing. And these kids didn't do a damn thing. They panicked. They put him on the sofa. They went in the basement, did more drugs, forgot about him, came up an hour later, he was dead. And then they drove around with his dead body for 2-3 hours, afraid to take it to the hospital. I ended up getting his girlfriend sober. The kid, Gary, was in and out. I think one of the other kids died. But I got to tell you, after the fact, it's like, should I have done anything? I don't know, because one of these kids called me last year and he's like, yeah, I was with your son when he died, and I want to tell you the truth. And I said, I know the truth, but why are you calling me? Well, I wanted you to know. And I said, why didn't you call 911 when my son was overdosing, you idiot? Because if you would have called 911, they had the Good Samaritan law. The cops and paramedics would have come, hopefully revived him, taken the drugs, and left. Nobody gets arrested. So it's things like this in my son's passing that my wife and I, Jennifer, now educate youth on, and law enforcement. You know, my high schools we've spoken, and these kids don't know about the Good Samaritan law. I mean, it's
well. What about
anyhow,
a couple things I want to touch on just of what you mentioned, because it's like it's such heavy stuff. But you mentioned, you know, what you're doing now. It's like the light, you know, at the end of the tunnel, or whatever you want to call it. You're working to get Narcan in all these places where it's not, right? And we talk about how badly people need Narcan nowadays with just opioids. I mean, it's all over the place, right? But I want to ask you about, you mentioned you're not responsible for your son's death, and you know that. But when people come behind you, whether they're in recovery or they have a son who's terribly addicted and they pass away, what do you tell those parents? What do you tell those guardians about life going forward?
Great question, Peter, because I'm the guy that gets all those calls. And it was ironic when my current wife and I got together 4 years ago.
That's Jennifer, right?
Yeah, I don't know how much time you got on here.
No, go ahead. Jennifer Jimenez, right?
Oh, boy, she's going to kick your ass. Yeah. Jennifer Jimenez.
Jimenez. All right, sorry.
Yep, you just lost 5 bonus points with my wife. You're going to have to earn those back. What the hell did you ask me? I'm already ADHD. How do you share with other people that have those experiences? So I get a lot of calls. You know, Jen and I, when we got together, we're doing all these events, and I can remember we're in, I'm trying to think of the name, somewhere in Pennsylvania. We did like 10 events in 3 days, and one of them was overdose awareness event. And there's about 400 people, and Jen can feel energy. And she said, Tim, it's dark in here, and you've got all these parents with their 12 and 14-year-old and 8-year-old kids just in hysterics about their dead kid that died 12 years ago and 10 years ago. And so I get up on stage and I tell it the way it is. And I don't care whose feelings I hurt. I'm not here to coddle. This shit is life and fucking death. And you better realize it. And where it is now, people are dying like I've never seen before. So anyhow, I got up and I shared and spoke, and I said, look, all you parents up here that are crying hysterically that your children died 5, 8, 10 years ago, I said, you are all living through the day they died, and you're stuck in a grief you're never going to get out of. I said, you're not celebrating the time your loved ones here were on earth and all the magical memories you made, good, bad, and different. You're stuck in the day they died, and you want to blame everyone. I said, the first person you might want to blame is looking in the mirror. Did you take any part in this? But there's help out there. I said, what I'd like to see is all you parents here have knowledge and wisdom. We've got treatment centers. We've got sober livings that these kids need guidance and direction. They need jobs. We need businesses. We need to come together and all be a part of this. And you parents can start some family groups and help parents whose kids are struggling and do some peer-driven stuff.
And help yourselves.
Yeah. And it's like, take the negative, turn it into a positive, because, you know, also the parents too, it happens. You know, they need to get trauma therapy. They need to work with the therapist, but everybody wants to blame. And the baffling thing is, we live out here in, you know, Beverly Hills, California now. And 2.5 months ago, we had 5 kids OD at Hollywood High School. 2 girls were in a bathroom and they weren't found for 8 hours. And one of them died. And we tried getting into the schools. We're offered to come in for free. And you know what the LAPD school superintendent's answer is? We've now got Narcan in the schools. This bullshit with Narcan, what I was preaching 8 years ago, they're preaching now. It should be everywhere. It's not even in the school systems in California. They're starting to put it in. And what I explained to the superintendent, I said, look, these kids don't know that if they're at a party at 15, they smoke some high-grade weed and someone offers them a pill or a line, if it's an opiate or fentanyl, they could die. But they'll be addicted that quick. And Narcan is a tool to save a life, but we need to do so much more and educate. And, we did 2 mass mailers to every school in California. We got 3 calls back.
Wow.
They don't want to talk about it. People's heads are still buried in the sand. And that's what's baffling to me. I mean, we're losing more people, but people are still in the sense they don't want to talk about it until it affects them. And then it's usually too late.
What are you guys doing now, you and Jennifer, as far as
when I met Jen, I got out of prison, did that. I had another child, Mackenzie. I got rid of, left her mom because she couldn't. Yeah,
you met a woman, a sober woman at the time, right? And then it didn't work
supposedly, but yeah, not really. So that's a whole different shit show in itself. But we've got joint custody of our daughter, and I'm working on trying to get her out here full time. But I was at the top of my game. I wrote a book called From Dope to Hope. I had a documentary on A&E, which is a day in the life of what I do. I was a guest of the 2016 State of the Union address. And I'll tell you, that was a neat experience because I started doing a bunch of work with Congressman Bill Foster, who was just a great guy. And he got me hooked up with Senator Dick Durbin and all these other people. What's this, honey? My wife's passing me a note. Hey, honey, do you want to meet Pete? He lost 5 bonus points with you. Just let you know.
I don't want to get in trouble.
I already. Why did you lose 5 bonus points? She wants to know.
Because I said Jimenez.
Oh, he said he didn't say Jimenez. He said Jimenez. So I scarred him on that. Only joking. She said to be nice. And that's how I am. I'm all over the place. My ADHD.
I love it, dude. I love it.
You got to. So anyhow, all this stuff happened. And Pete, for me, I was working in treatment, putting a ton of people in. Then I'm running my nonprofit, but people don't understand. I had a board of directors, but, I basically leveraged all the money. Somebody would call. I'm getting them set up to go to this peer driven. I'm buying the bus ticket, the plane ticket. I coordinate everything. And I had 3 cell phones, and it got to be too much. And I thought I had to save everyone. And I've been to 150 funerals since my son died. And they were all people I'd been working with, or treatment or relapse or suicide. I quit going, and I was experiencing a lot of trauma. And I started, I was doing 250, 300 speaking events. And a lot of women were coming up and spewing all their trauma. And I said, look, I'm a speaker. I'm not a clinician. So I want to partner with another female. And of course, Jennifer, was a supermodel and an actress and, the OG of long-term women's recovery. And I shot her a message. We'd been following each other on social media, but never interacted, and said, hey, would you be interested in maybe partnering up to speak as a power couple or open a center, do interventions together? And she said, yeah. And turned out she was going to Florida. I was going to Florida. I flew down there, and I was only there for 2 days, and I got busy and I blew her off.
Oh,
well, then I get the message. Hey,
talk about no bonus points.
Boy, what an idiot. Yeah. She's like, hey, jerk, thanks for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. So we started talking, and about 6 weeks in, she said, look, Tim, I think you're a great guy, and it's strictly business. She said, but you're always saying you got to check your plan or this. If you want to do something, let's do it. Otherwise, I'm moving on. So she pissed me off. I bought a plane ticket that Tuesday. I texted it to her. I said, you can pick me up at Fort Lauderdale Airport Friday. I flew in. She picked me up, gave me a hug. We went right to a business meeting. 4 hours after that was done, we were having lunch. I looked, and I'm in the middle of my second divorce now. I looked her right in the eyes and I said, I'm going to marry you and spend the rest of my life with you. And she said, hold on, you just met me. Maybe you want to finish your divorce. I said, that'll be done in the next 4 to 5 weeks. She goes, maybe you want to sow your oats. I said, I don't roll that way. I was divorced 5 weeks later. We were engaged 4 months later, and we got married that year, December 31st of 2019, down at the Justice of the Peace in Beverly Hills. And from Jen being a supermodel, discovered at 13 and traveling the world, and then music videos with people like, Lionel Richie, Mick Jagger, Tupac Shakur, Babyface, and into acting, her breakout roles in one of the most epic drug movies, Blow, with Johnny Depp, and she played the drug lord's wife, and Vanilla Sky and Charlie's Angels and Sweetest Thing. And at the top of her game, she couldn't stay sober. And my wife hung herself in the psych ward and had to learn how to walk and talk and wheelchair to a walker. And Dr. Drew Pinsky was her doctor and said she called my mother-in-law 3 times and said, your daughter's one of these hopeless cases. We'll go through the motions, but I don't know if she's going to make it through the detox. And she did, and got a kick-ass sponsor. And Jen got sober in the hood in Compton. And 2.5 years later, Dr. Drew called her and said, what are you up to? And she said, nothing. Why? And he said, well, I'm doing this spinoff show from Celebrity Rehab called Sober House, and I want you to run the house. And she said, why me? And he said, it's people like you that prove me wrong and keep me doing what I do on a daily basis. And she said, ain't that about a bitch? So she did a bunch of seasons of Sober House, Celebrity Rehab, 4 seasons of Beverly Housewives. She was working for a program out of Florida, speaking all over the country for 7 years. We got together, came out here. We had 85 speaking events booked, and that thing called COVID hit.
Ugh.
And we lost all that business in 2 weeks. Jenny and I both were about 4 months in. We're 2 people to get COVID. We had it for 10 weeks. It almost killed both of us. I would rather kick heroin in a prison cell than have what we had. We were saying our goodbyes and all this. We got through that. We started a podcast. We were doing interventions in the heat of COVID. And and now we're here. We still do speaking events. We do interventions. I just filmed my first feature film 4 months ago. Jenny's back acting. We're consulting, executive producing, acting on a project on the opiate epidemic in Appalachia. We're consulting to a couple higher end treatment programs.
Do you do stuff like sober coaching to actors and stuff like that? I mean, I know you can't mention people.
We do. So yes, we do sober coaching. We do interventions. We do speaking events. We guide and direct people into treatment. I love you, honey. We're getting involved with the oldest sober living and boutique treatment center in Southern California here. So we got our hands in a lot of different things, but I'll tell you, it's a different world here because Jenny kept saying, wait till you come to LA. The recovery is different. I'm like, bullshit. The recovery is so much different.
How is it different? Because my brother's sober. He lives out there in Hermosa. I've been to meetings out there a bunch, but it is different. How would you describe it?
And I'm the most transparent and honest person you'll ever meet. I tell the truth almost 2 months. About 1.5 years ago, I'm 10 years sober. November 1st, I had 10 years sober. But about 1.5 years ago, I wanted to eat a bullet. I want to kill myself. And I've never had thoughts of killing myself. And I got a new sponsor who's got 33 years sober. He plays in a big band. I won't name his name. I have a grand sponsor who's got 46 years sober. My sponsor does a meeting every day. He's never missed one in 33 years. And I sat down with John and I said, look, he kind of interviewed me. He said, so how much time you got at the time? It was 8.5 years. He said, when's the last time you went through the steps? I said, it's been a while. He said, we're going to go through the steps again. He said, what's your routine? And I said, well, I read some books and do this. He said, well, you're going to have at least 2 to 3 commitments. You're going to be sponsoring at least 3 to 5 guys. You're going to do a gratitude list every morning. You're going to get into transcendental meditation. You're going to meditate 20 minutes in the morning, 20 minutes in the afternoon. You're going to be at my house Thursday night for our home group. You're going to be at Bread and Roses Thursday morning. Oh, you're also going to have at least 2 commitments at meetings. And yeah, let's get to work. And the group of men I roll with now, I mean, I only hang out with people that are in long-term recovery, that are in the solution. I work and sponsor and work with younger people, but my sobriety is fucking sacred to me. The most important aspect of my life is my relationship with God and my recovery. Then it's my family, then it's my work. Because I don't have work and I don't have family without recovery. And it's like we started a Zoom when COVID hit, and I've got a West Side men's group that are the most hardcore, authentic men. Any people, I run it every Wednesday and I bring in speakers, and every person I've had speak said, Tim, I've never seen a group of men like this that are authentic. We real talk. There's men crying and laughing and supporting, and it's just not bullshit. This is life and death, and that's what makes it different out here. And I love my life. If I could have a bumper sticker that said Property of Alcoholics Anonymous, I'd put it on my car and I'd tattoo it on my body.
I fucking love it.
It's as simple as that. But yeah, we got our hands in a lot of things. But what I do now is I've got more balance. I pick and choose what we can really work on, what we can't, because when Jen met me, I had 3 cell phones. They were on 24/7. She said, here's your phone. There's a thing on here called Do Not Disturb. You're going to put that on at 9 p.m. every night, and those other phones, get rid of them. And that's what I did.
And you got what you needed out of that, because you do need, we all need time to decompress and to take it easy for ourselves. That's part of sobriety. All right, Tim, anything else? You're the best. We've hit an hour. I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed talking to you and just hearing your story, and it's palpable, dude, and it comes through the screen and it comes through the microphone and it really touches people. So thank you.
I appreciate it. No, I just want to let people know, if you got a heartbeat, you got hope. This is the hardest thing to do. Put your hand up and ask for help. Whether you're in addiction, you're struggling with suicidal ideations, you're struggling with mental health, or you're a parent or a loved one of someone struggling. You guys need help too. I'm available everywhere. Reach out, find me.
Yeah, I'll put all the links in the show notes.
Yeah, please do, man. Yeah. And Peter, I really appreciate this. I sorry I talked so much.
Nah, that's the best. You're the best kind of guest.
Awesome. You got it, my brother. You be well, okay?
All right, thanks, Tim. Appreciate it, dude.
Thanks, Peter. See you, buddy.
Later, man.
Bye.
Thanks so much for listening to The Payoff with Pete. Once again, I'm Pete Souza. And of course, we are part of the Rogue Media Network. All kinds of good podcasts you can find at roguemedianetwork.com. And of course, you can find this podcast and all those other ones wherever you get your podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, other spots like that.
This has been a Rogue Media Network production.